I warmly welcome you to the Manifested e-learning platform. We are studying the subject Governance and Compliance Audit. We are moving to the fourth chapter, which is Legal, Regulatory and Professional and Ethical Considerations. This chapter has 9 subtopics, namely 1. Legal requirements on governance and compliance audit for different types of legal entities. Number 2, codes of governance as issued by of certified secretaries, different industry regulators. 3, regulatory framework of governance and compliance audit industry regulators. 4, governance and compliance audit standards by Institute of Certified Secretaries. 5, code of ethics for certified secretaries. 6, auditors authority, professional liability, and legal responsibilities. 7, professional objectivity, professional skepticism, and professional judgment. Number 8, the role of ICS in governance and compliance auditing. Number 9, ethics and integrity as a compliance issue. The last subtopic is ethics and integrity as a compliance issue. We will be tackling a subtopic one at a time. Today we begin with the legal requirements on governance and compliance audit for different types of legal entities. Now, in Kenya, candidates, legal requirements for governance and compliance audits vary significantly depending on the type of legal entity. It also depends on its sector and whether it's publicly listed or a public entity. So, the requirements are primarily aimed at promoting transparency, accountability, investor confidence, public finance integrity, consumer protection, and also data protection. So we are going to study the legal requirements on governance and compliance audit for different types of legal entities. And these entities, we are going to categorize them into 6. 1 is the publicly listed companies. Number 2 is the state corporations. Number 3, we have SACCOs. Number 4, the microfinance institutions. Number 5, non-governmental organizations. And lastly, private companies. So those are 6 types of legal entities, which we are going to study the legal requirements on governance and compliance audit. And I've said that the legal requirements for governance and compliance audits vary depending on many factors like the legal entity, as we shall be discussing, and also the sectors, and also whether the entity is publicly listed or just a public entity. So let's begin with publicly listed companies. Publicly listed companies. We begin with publicly listed. The publicly listed companies, issuers of securities to the public. So what is the governing legislation? Now, first of all, the governing legislation for publicly listed companies is the Companies Act, together with the Capital Markets Act, all right, and the CMA Code of Corporate Governance Practices for issuers of securities to the public. So you have publicly listed companies, issuers, the publicly listed companies, issuers of securities to the public, issuers of securities to the public. And I've said that the governing legislation is the Companies Act, the Capital Markets Act and regulations, and the Capital Markets Authority a Code of Corporate Governance Practices for Issuers of Securities to the Public. That is 2015, the CMA Code. So what is the governance audit requirements. Governance audit requirements. We want to study the governance audit requirements because we are studying the legal requirements on governance and compliance audit. So the governance requirements for publicly listed companies include the mandatory annual governance audit. One, mandatory. That is to mean that publicly listed companies are required by law to conduct governance audits. Okay? We have the mandatory annual governance audits. Mandatory governance audits. And that is in line with clause 2.7 of the CMA code, which mandates that all listed companies and licensed intermediaries to undertake a governance audit by a qualified and accredited governance auditor. For example, it could be the Institute of Certified Secretaries. Then there is disclosure obligation. Apart from the mandatory annual governance audit, there is the disclosure obligation. Disclosure obligation. The disclosure obligations. Companies are required to disclose the outcomes of the governance audit in their annual reports, demonstrating their level of compliance with the code. Another requirement is in relation to board evaluation, board and committee effectiveness. Committee effectiveness. Board and committee effectiveness. Now, the audit assesses pillars like board operations and control, pillars like transparency and disclosure, pillars like ethical leadership, risk management, internal controls, stakeholder engagement, and so on. And Section 770 of the Companies Act specifically requires the audit committee of a quoted company to annually assess the extent to which the company has observed its corporate governance principles and strategies. Then lastly, there is the continuous. There is continuous improvement. The audit should inform continuous improvement in governance practice and policies. The auditor should do what? Inform continuous improvement. So these are the governance audit requirements for publicly listed companies, issuers of securities to the public. Okay? So these are governance requirements. But we also have compliance audit requirements. Compliance audit requirements. And don't forget, candidates, we are studying governance and compliance. So what are the compliance audit requirements for publicly listed companies? What are the compliance audit requirements for publicly listed companies? The first compliance audit requirements is statutory financial audit. Statutory financial audit. Publicly listed companies are required to conduct a statutory financial audit. This audit is mandated annually under the Companies Act for most companies, with the exception of very small private companies. So this audit primarily ensures financial statements give a true and fair view and comply with all respect with the international financial reporting standards and other statutory requirements. That is the first compliance audit requirement. The second one is the compliance audit. Independent legal and compliance audit. independent, legal and compliance audit. Number 2, independent, legal and compliance audit. Now, the Capital Markets Authority Code also requires the board of a listed company to subject the company to an independent legal and compliance audit at least once every 2 years. And this audit focuses specifically on adherence to applicable laws, regulations, internal policies, contractual arrangements, and it must be carried out by a legal professional in good standing with the Law Society of Kenya. 3, tax compliance. That's the third compliance audit requirements, tax compliance. Now, regular audits by the Kenya Revenue Authority are required to ensure compliance with Income Tax Act, the VAT Act, withholding tax, and housing levy, and other specific sector-specific compliance. Sector-specific compliance. Sector-specific compliance is also required depending on the industry. For example, we may have the banking industry, insurance industry, or telecommunications industry. So this is depending on the industry compliance with the regulations from bodies like the Central Bank of Kenya, the Insurance Regulatory Authority, the Communications Authority of Kenya, and so on. Depending on the sector. The banking sector will have its own regulations and so on. So we have data protection. Data. There's also compliance with regard to data. All right? Data protection. Data protection. This is another requirement. Data is becoming a huge thing, and companies are required to include to comply with the Data Protection Act, including principles of data processing, registration with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, and also potentially the data protection impact assessment and audit requirements as per the data protection. That is the conduct of compliance audit regulations. Occupation and safety. Occupation and safety. We also have another requirement in regard to occupational safety. Occupational safety and health. Occupational safety and health. Companies are required to comply also, candidates. Candidates are required to comply with the Occupational Safety and Health Act, including mandatory annual safety audits by registered safety and health advisors. Then we have environmental compliance. Environmental compliance. Environmental compliance. Environmental compliance. This is for relevant industries. For example, compliance with the National Environmental Management Authority, that is NEMA regulations under the Environmental Management and Coordination Act. So these are the governance audit requirements, and these are compliance audit requirements for publicly listed companies, issuers of securities to the public. Let's move to the second type of entity. We are candidates discussing the legal requirements on governance and compliance audit for different types of legal entities. We've discussed the one for public listed companies. We are moving to the second entity, which is state corporations. State corporations. Number 2, state corporations. State corporations and other public entities. Now, the governing legislation of these state corporations is the Constitution of Kenya, chapter 12 of the Finance Act. These institutions are also governed by the Public Finance Management Act and its regulations. There is also the Public Audit Act. They are governed by the Mwongozo Code of Governance for State Corporations and State Corporations Act. Those are the 5 governing legislations for state corporations. I repeat, state corporations in Kenya are governed by 1, the Constitution of Kenya. Number 2, the Public Finance Management Act. Number 3, the Public Audit Act. Number 4, the Mwongozo Code of Governance for State Corporations. And lastly, the State Corporations Act. So let's now highlight the governance audit requirements for state corporations. Governance audit. What are the governance audit requirements for state corporations in Kenya? Now, the first one is a mandatory governance assessment, and that is according to Mwongozo. Mandatory governance assessment. Governance assessment. Mandatory governance assessment. Now, while not explicitly called governance audits in all instances, Mwongozo provides a comprehensive framework for assessing board effectiveness, transparency, accountability, risk management, internal controls, and ethical leadership. In fact, it is clause 8.4, which of the Mwongozo code, which requires a comprehensive and independent legal audit at least once every 2 years to establish the level of adherence to applicable laws, regulations, and standards. And this often encompasses governance aspects. Then you have board evaluation. Board evaluation. Mwongozo emphasizes annual board evaluations, which serve as an internal governance assessment. 3, reporting to Parliament. Reporting to Parliament or relevant ministries. Entities are generally required to report on their governance status to oversight bodies like the Parliament or relevant ministries. So these are 3 governance audit requirements. Then we have compliance audit requirements. What are the compliance audit requirements for state corporations? The first is audit by Auditor-General. Audit by Auditor-General. They are required to be audited by the Auditor-General. That's the first compliance audit requirements. The Auditor-General is constitutionally mandated under Article 229 and empowered by the Public Audit Act to audit the accounts of all public entities, and this includes financial audits, which ensure public money has been applied lawfully and in an effective manner, and that financial statements comply with public sector accounting standards. So that's the first audit, financial audit. Then there is the compliance audit. So here we have financial audit by the Auditor-General. Then we have compliance audit. which is required to be conducted. This means compliance audit means verifying that the collection of revenue and expenditure of public money has been used for the purpose intended, and it's in authority for such expenditure, and that activities, financial transactions, and information comply with governing authorities. There is also the value for money audits. Value for money audits. Apart from the financial audits and compliance audits, the Auditor-General is required to conduct value for money audits. That means assessing economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. So that's the first compliance audit requirement. The second compliance audit requirement is what we call the public procurement compliance. Public procurement requirement. Public procurement requirement or compliance. This is strict adherence to the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, with audits verifying compliance in procurement processes. You understand? There is also the HR and labor laws. HR and labor laws. Compliance with HR and labor laws. That's another compliance audit requirement. This is compliance with the Employment Act and other labor laws regarding terms of employment, statutory deductions, and workplace safety. 4 is data protection. Data protection. Public entities as data controllers or processors must comply with the Data Protection Act, including registration with the Commissioner and also potential data protection audits. So that's it, candidates for state corporations. That's the third entity. We move to the second entity. We move to the third entity, which is SACCOs. We are candidates studying the legal requirements of governance and compliance audit for different types of legal entities. The third legal entity is SACCOs. This is savings and credit cooperative societies, and the governing legislation. These are governed by the SACCO Societies Act, number 1. Number 2, we have the SACCO Societies Regulatory Authority regulations. Number 3, we have the Cooperative Societies Act, and that is for non-deposit taking SACCOs. All right. So what are the governance and compliance audit requirements? Governance and compliance audit requirements include, number 1, SASRA oversight. SASRA oversight. SASRA oversight. They include SASRA oversight. SASRA oversight. Okay? They include SASRA oversight. Because we have the deposit-taking SACCOs that are highly regulated by SASRA, which sets stringent requirements for governance, for risk management, for capital adequacy, and also liquidity. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is annual external audit. Annual external audit is the third requirement. And these are audits that ought to be conducted by certified auditors. These audits verify financial health, they verify loan portfolios, asset bases, and also compliance with established accounting standards and SASRA regulations. 3 is internal controls. Internal controls. Number 3, internal controls. Internal controls. SACCOs must establish robust internal controls and fraud prevention mechanisms which are subject to audit. 4, corporate governance. Corporate governance. That's another requirement. Such regulations and also the Act requires well-structured governance systems, including an elected board of directors, management committees, and supervisory committees. And audits assess adherence to these structures and related policies. Then we have the anti-money laundering, compliance with anti-money laundering. 5, compliance with anti-money laundering. Compliance with anti-money laundering. The anti-money laundering compliance. This is compliance with anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regulations, including know your customer procedures and reporting suspicious transactions to the Financial Reporting Center. Then we also have the data protection compliance. Data protection compliance. Number 6, data protection compliance. Data protection compliance is yet another governance and compliance audit requirements. Data protection compliance. This is compliance with the Data Protection Act, especially concerning member data confidentiality. So that is the 3rd legal entity. Then we have the 4th one, which is the microfinance institutions. Microfinance institutions. Now, the governing legislation for microfinance institutions, number 1, is the Microfinance Act of 2006. Then we have the Central Bank of Kenya regulations. So what are the governance? What are the governance and compliance audit requirements? What are the governance and compliance audit requirements? Now, the first requirement is CBK licensing and oversight. 1, CBK licensing and oversight. CBK licensing and oversight. Deposit-taking microfinancial institutions are licensed and regulated by the Central Bank of Kenya. And the non-deposit-taking microfinance institutions also require CBK licensing and oversight. So that's the first requirement, CBK licensing and oversight. Then the second governance and compliance audit requirements is annual external audit. Annual external audit. Number 2, annual external audits. Annual external audits. This is a mandatory annual external audits by approved auditors, often requiring submission of audited financial statements for the past 3 years during the licensing process. Prudential guidelines. Number 3, prudential guidelines. Prudential guidelines. Prudential guidelines. This is compliance with CBK prudential guidelines covering capital adequacy, liquidity, asset quality, and risk management. And these are key areas for compliance audits. Compliance audits will be required to verify if the microfinancial institutions have complied with prudential guidelines. Prudential guidelines. You understand, candidates? Yes. Then number 4, we have what we call corporate governance standards. 4, corporate governance standards. Corporate governance standards. Corporate governance standards. CBK regulations often prescribe specific governance standards for financial institutions, including board composition, independence, and also internal control frameworks, which are subject to audit review. And similar to SACCOs, candidates number 5, anti-money laundering and